So usually when I'm standing up here, in other circumstances, not at Future Med, there are a lot of my first job is resolving a lot of contradictions that strike people. One of them is has to do with our strange name of QuantStrat, quantitative analysis and strategic initiatives. People don't necessarily know how those go together. They certainly don't know how they apply in an academic medical center. But the main contradiction that generally, is the first to come to mind is who invited the rabbi onto stage. So you can imagine it's not just in a context like this, working in a hospital, looking like I do. It's sometimes get confused with the chaplain, and so it gives me an opportunity to explain the interesting work that we're doing. Actually, there's a funny story. When I was about a year into working at Sloan Kettering and been working very closely with our chief of solid tumor oncology, Dr. Spriggs. And I have to have my lines. I'm walking through the hospital and somebody says, "Excuse me, are you the chaplain?" And I have to be ready to say quickly, "Actually, I'm sorry, I only play a rabbi on TV," or come up with other things. And but sometimes, you don't have a chance. You don't have something right at the tip, right at the tip of your tongue, and and you're passing by a room and says, "Rabbi, can you please say a prayer with my mother?" And you don't have enough time to think of something, and I do know a couple of prayers. And I said, "Sure." I go in there and saying a prayer with his mom, and trying to provide them whatever comfort I can provide them. And in walks Dr. Spriggs, and apparently this woman was his patient. And he looks at his patient, and he looks at me, and he says, "Ari, what the hell are you doing here?" Yeah. So, but we get through this. So, but I'm here to tell you about the work that we are doing and give you some of the history of why it is that I am working at a hospital, because a lot of it was what I would call divine serendipity of how we came to build the team at Memorial Sloan Kettering. So it's an institution with a lot of storied history. We've been specialized treating cancer care for nearly 130 years. And along with that history comes a lot of human history in the forms of patients being treated. And a lot of those patients, certainly over the last 20 years or so, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, we've been capturing significant amount of data on. Structured data in a very organized way. We had a visionary CIO named Wei-Ti Chang who years and years before others was actually capturing the structured data in an organized form in one institutional database. And the nature of our data is pretty unique. It's not just that we have a lot of patients that we've seen in Sloan Kettering, more cancer patients than others, and that we've been capturing the data for a long time. It's the nature of how we treat these patients. We treat these patients, as Dr. Madison can relate to, but very few others probably in the healthcare world can. We actually treat these patients longitudinally over years and years. And so we see not just an acute incident and what happened during that acute incident, but we see what's happening with a patient from the time that they come in to first consult with a physician to hopefully a long-term cure. So just to give you an example of quite how deep that data is. So this is just an example using a cohort builder that we've built. And I'll get to a little bit more about the tools that we've built internally. Take over about 10 years of patients, find 52,000 lung cancer patients, a little bit less, about 7 years of information. And then you're actually asking a scientific question here, and so you can't just take all of those patients and see what happened to them. You have to specify other criteria. So we say, we only want the ones where the first tumor that was identified was lung, where it wasn't a metastasis to the lung. And then we want a specific histology. We want non-small cell lung cancer. We might just want to see adenocarcinoma, not squamous. And then we want to see a particular stage. You want to see, make sure that we have all the proper pharmacy data on, make sure they've gotten the treatments we care about. And then you get to the number that would fit the study criteria, and it's 461 out of that original 52,000, and you think, wow, that's a tiny portion, but actually that's a lot larger than a lot of prospective studies. So when you have this volume of data that you're starting out with, you can actually build a cohort that's really meaningful in terms of statistical significance with very specific criteria. So that brings me to what our role is in this. I mean, we have had great teams that have been collecting the data, organizing the data. We have years of history of expertise where our physicians have been developing an intuitive expertise. They lead the nation in terms of publishing guidelines and the like. But the question is, how do we harness that data? So a lot of people use the analogy of miners, of data mining, right? And it's true. I came from a background in financial economics. I took an internship because we had a visionary leader named Wendy Perchik who decided that this type of analysis was important. And she asked me to do some work over the summer, and it was just some forecasting and did some analysis of wait times in the clinics. And she said, we need more of this. And we wanted to create a team. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But the fact is that, I came into an institution that was sitting on a gold mine. They were just an absolute gold mine of data. We've talked a lot of, Tim has spoke about the value of the data. And I came into an institution with better data than anywhere else. So what's our role? I see our role is more than just being the gold miners, being the miners of the data miners. I see our role as being the lamplighters. We're the ones helping to find the patterns in the data. We're the ones who are working with the physicians, with the researchers, with the administrators, and answering their questions to help actually turn this data into value. So we have skill sets that are not usually found in healthcare. Not only do I look different, strange, we have skills that don't typically fit in. First guy I hired for our team had a background in theoretical math. So I started, straight. I actually never finished my PhD at Yale, and Wendy plucked me away. We realized with our fourth kid coming, we weren't going to make it on a $25,000 stipend. So that was me in 2003, just doing a little bit more of this full time. Started hiring people. We became the official institutional department of strategic planning and innovation with another group. And eventually, built up a team that had done enough work that we were recognized by Informs, and we got the Informs Prize in 2012. We were the first hospital and the first nonprofit to win the Informs Prize. Other winners had been in the past, IBM, GE, and the like. So right now, we are where we are now, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along. So our original focus was on operational dynamics. We came in, we started trending activity, looking at forecasting our activity. I did a model on how we should staff our operating rooms, creating a genetic algorithm. And as we were successful in that process, they started asking us more strategic questions. Where should we build our next site? What programs should we potentially be growing? And throughout this process, we had some success, but we noticed that all of the data that we were using for the operational questions, for the strategic questions, actually was of significant clinical value. And we started to say, what can we do with this that would actually allow us to harness that clinical value, that clinical data? So let me give you just a few examples of the types of work that we've done. They go across the board in lots of different categories. On the operational side, one of the early things that we did was create a predictive model for our inpatient census. That is our biggest resource constraint, is our inpatient census, and we have to be able to know how to manage it properly. And so I created a model using regression analysis, looking at basic factors that would allow us to anticipate when we were going to go over census. So it's easy to think that you can look at how many patients are in the hospital right now, and that's going to affect how many there will be in the future. And you could look at how many surgeries are scheduled for that week, and you know that that's going to be predictive. But it turns out there are lots of other things that are predictive as well. The amount of chemotherapy activity with a lag of 1 month is a significant predictor of how many people we're going to have admitted to the hospital in a given week. And we know that there are certain toxicities associated with chemotherapies, and it's actually the type of toxicities that we can anticipate, and actually now we can use that knowledge to preempt. So that was one example of an operational use, and it was of significant use. They're able to bring in additional nursing staff when that alert goes off, and be prepared to deal with increased census. An example of one of the strategic questions had to do with understanding our environment where we're working and how cancer affects the greater New York area. So there, certainly when we started, there was not really good reporting of New York State cancer in the New York State Cancer Registry. And it was only reported on a county level, and it wasn't reported often enough. So we didn't really know on a cancer by cancer level how much cancer was occurring in the greater New York area. But there is a great national registry called the SEER Registry, and they actually track cancer in a lot of different areas, and they track it by age, race, gender. They break it down for each cancer. And we've got local demographic data, right? So we could figure out, based on the local demographics of zip code by zip code, and then apply that same age, race, gender for each cancer, and figure out what's the expected cancer incidence for each zip code in our catchment area. And then once we know that, right, it's important for us to know how many of them are coming to be treated at Sloan Kettering and where we're having the impact that we're having. And we actually, my team, thank God, doesn't have to deal with a lot of the finance and marketing stuff. It's not the type of institution we're at in general. We're a truly mission-driven, not-for-profit institution. It's an amazing place to work for. I think we have some selection bias at FutureMed here because there are a few other institutions like that. Certainly Kaiser Permanente has that reputation. Stanford Children's certainly seems that way as well. But it is unusual. And just to give you one example here, one of the early projects that I did was for the Center for Image-Guided Interventions. I helped model with the surgeons and the interventional radiologists what type of activity could transfer over the years from traditional surgeries to image-guided interventions. And we came up with our model. We figured out what types of resources we would need for that type of center, and then we handed it off to the accountants. I didn't have any part after that. The accountants came back and they said it was going to lose $10 million over the first 5 years. And any of you who have worked on, with healthcare providers know that know how the conversation typically goes after that. Our CFO, Mike Gutnick, who's Chief Financial Officer, whose job it is to focus on the finance, he heard the number, we're going to lose $10 million over the first 5 years, and his first question, he turned to me and he said, "Ari, how many lives are we going to save?" I mean, that's an amazing place to work for. We'll put aside the fact that I had no clue, I couldn't answer the question. But it's amazing to work in a place where the CFO asks that kind of question. So if you are going to think about it from an accounting side, you need to know this stuff as well. So if you think of each one of those blue lines as representing a different disease diagnosis, and there's a certain accounting value that's associated with each of those patients, it's not actually, even if you cared nothing about but the bottom line, it doesn't really help you to know that because there's an opportunity cost of the resources associated with it. This is something that came from my economics background. And so, you'll have leukemia patients, who get very intense level of care, but they actually use a tremendous number of inpatient days. And even if you were just looking at the accounting, you could say that you could bring in 9 patients with breast cancer and use those inpatient beds to help nine patients instead of 1. Now, we're not an institution that works that way, so we didn't decide, okay, we're going to stop growth of our leukemia program. But what we did do is look at the opportunities for research in leukemia, say we have to grow this, but how should we grow it? And so that actually, this insight initiated the process of moving a lot of our transplant process outpatient, and that can be done in a very safe way and in a way that the patients really appreciate, as it turns out, and it helps free up our beds for other patients as well. So now we get to the clinical value of the data. Start again, just looking at it from a cost perspective. You can look, each one of these bars represents a non-small cell lung cancer, the amount of cost per week of treatment for patients with adenocarcinoma and lung who are receiving a particular regimen. So these are the different possible regimens. And you see there's different levels of cost. But now when we actually start to ask the question, what clinical value can we extract from this data, we can start answering all kinds of other questions as well. So we created a Cox proportional hazard model looking at age, race, gender, some of the things we talked about before, smoking history, some of the things specifically relevant for non-small cell lung cancer. And we started to say, now we know how much it costs to treat these patients. And by the way, this isn't just the drug costs. So if you look at the survival data, and I'm sorry, I don't have a laser pointer here to show you, but there are two of them right near each other, and one of them looks like it's dominated by the other. So there's one where it's about 6 or 7 from the right here, where the blue bar is higher and the orange bar, the blue bar is higher in the first one, and the orange bar is higher in the second one. So that means the expected survival for these patients is greater and their cost is lower. Now it turns out that the first one, the one that has the benefit, actually is a 3-drug regimen. It's the same regimen as the next one, which is a 2-drug regimen. And that third drug is a really expensive drug. So you say, how's that possible, right? If you're just looking at the cost of the drugs, right, by definition, the 3-drug regimen's got to be more expensive. But it turns out those receiving the 2-drug regimen had a lot more inpatient days, a lot more complications, and we actually saved, there was actually lower cost of giving patients the 3-drug regimen. Now, those of you who are astute here will notice very quickly that all the way on the right, there's one that makes no sense at all. Where the cost is so high and the survival is so low, why would anybody ever give that regimen? And that helps provide some of the insight into how we're collecting this data and what the actual ultimate value of the data might be. Because it turns out that there's limitations to our structured data. And there are things that we weren't capturing. And one of the things we weren't capturing was their performance, the patient's performance status. So it turns out that those patients on the right were very low performance status patients. They were patients who the doctors deemed not to be even strong enough to get a typical chemotherapy regimen. They were given Megace, and they were basically end-of-life patients. And so if we had just taken something like this and tried to publish it, it wouldn't have been insightful enough as it is, but it was really insightful in terms of what it told us about what our data contained and what it didn't contain. So we did a little bit more massaging, manual massaging. We got the performance status manually. We got some of the smoking history manually. And we've decided to test ourselves and say, the ultimate test of our data, if you want to look at retrospective data, is can it replicate what you'd see in a prospective study? So we found a large prospective study in non-small cell lung cancer, the Scagliotti study, and compared 2 drugs, pemetrexed and gemcitabine, in non-small cell lung cancer. And it showed a clear superiority for pemetrexed over gemcitabine in adenocarcinoma in lung. And we said, can we take this large prospective study that took years and millions of dollars, and can we replicate it with our own internal data? So this is what we got on our own. The answer was yes, and it was almost to the p-value. But the problem was it took a lot of the manual massaging. We didn't have a lot of the data that we needed in structured form, and we had to actually scan through the notes and collect a lot of it manually. So we said, how might we do that? And so that was shortly before I met Marty for the first time. I had in my head that IBM would be the absolute best partner in the world for scaling up a capability like this, and I heard a little bit about their capabilities in terms of natural language processing. And so that first visit is what initiated our partnership with Watson. Marty's told you a lot about Watson, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but I'll say that the role of my team in this process, we've continued to play a role, has been sort of as the translators between the MSK clinicians and the IBM developers. I won't go into the details, but that translation has proved to be really, really critical and has led to a lot of the insights that Marty mentioned before, such as needing to highlight the information that's missing for the relevant patient. So, since Marty's talked about this, I'll just zoom through, but you can't work with just rules-based medicine anymore. Even if it's rules-based, that's where we have guidelines that are formed by really experts in the field, because it's limited in its time value, it's limited in its ultimate content, and where you have guidelines that say that any patient with a EGFR mutation should get erlotinib, it doesn't account for the fact, well, there was a paper that just came out that said that those with a particular exon 20 insertion in the EGFR mutation actually don't benefit from erlotinib. And so that's the type of insight that we're hoping to bring to the process, and the expertise of knowing where to look for this information, how to rank that information in terms of its value, and train the system overall so that it can start to think more like an MSK physician. So what we learned from this process was there are a lot of cool things we could do. What I also learned is that we're not going to be able to do everything that we originally envisioned with IBM. IBM had a particular mission in mind, which is replicating the best standard of care using the entire broad base of knowledge as that knowledge base develops. We wanted to learn from some of the things they do, but they are a for-profit organization, and they weren't going to hand over all of their language-aware code, NLP code, to us. And so we decided we needed to develop a lot of these skills on our own internally. And so we kind of shifted what it was that we were looking for, and the skills that we were looking for, and the people that I was hiring, and we brought some new skill sets onto the team. That particularly empower some of the skills in clinical analytics. And that brings, I mentioned before about the value of the expertise in our organization, the history of our organization, the data structure in our organization, the tremendous information systems group that we have. But we also have tremendous academic collaborators at Sloan Kettering. And so when we started asking these questions, we started turning to our friends in computational biology, our new Center for Molecular Oncology, medical physics that's doing image analysis, and taking some of the raw imaging data and turning that into structured data as well. And we said, how can we work together? How can we start to put this whole big picture together so that we could ask a question like we did when trying to replicate that lung study and actually have it all there available for us in an automated fashion, the vision that I originally had when I first went to IBM. So we've actually started building a lot of these capabilities. We've built our own NLP and machine learning, where we're able to extract the key information from the notes where we don't have it in the structured data. We've got an actual something that was originally called Pocket Knife. We now call it our knowledge extraction tool, where we can start to train the notes based on this, where the physicians can actually go through it, highlight it, get the key information, I tag it, and then start to learn, create the machine learning models that actually tell it what it is. And actually, now as a result, we actually can get the KPS, Karnofsky performance status, through this NLP machine learning process on our own. We've done it with smoking status. We've done it with we've done it in several other areas as well. Performance status we extract with 100% accuracy. That means 0 false positives, 0 false negatives. We start to automate more. We start to be able to put together the drugs and the episodes of care, create the algorithms, automate the algorithms that allow you to identify those patients. And now, all that process that was half manual when we did it originally, when we just showed the power of our retrospective data, we can now do for the first time, at least in beta form, we can now do in an automated fashion. So I mentioned before about the role of lamplighters. So I said, I typically have to counter people's stereotypes. But I'm going to reinforce it here since we've developed some trust. So I'll give you a little Dvar Torah, which is a sermon, even though I'm not a rabbi, which is today's the first day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, which is the month of Hanukkah. So it's the month of lights. And it particularly in Kabbalah and Hasidut, it talks a lot about the value of how a little bit of light can push off a lot of darkness. And we see our job as not necessarily being the ones to cure cancer. We see ourselves as being able to light up the pathways for all the incredible people that we work with. So thank you very much.